Electionland project at ProPublica. And today I'm going to talk to you about how the project has evolved and sort of how we focus our energy and what we are thinking about this year. So this project is a collaborative project in which we make resources available to our partners to share data and knowledge that they can use to do their own reporting. And we also do some one-on-one partnerships that involve co-reporting or co-publishing stories. This is the third year that we have run this project. We did an experiment in 2016 to really do a massive version of this project. You can see me in the middle left of the screen. At the time I was working at a different outlet, and I was one of the partners on the project. And then in 2018, we refined the model for our reporting to focus more on tips we were receiving rather than trying to use searching on social media to find problems ourselves. And in 2020, the main difference that we are working with this year is we are also going to try to focus our energy on looking at tips, incoming tips, what we are receiving about problems that people are having to vote. And we will be doing it all virtually instead of in a newsroom. This pop-up newsroom you see here that we usually do at CUNY in New York. It will be all virtual this year. So the way the project is structured is we get tips from the public that we collect with the help of our partners and us. We get access to call center data from the Election Protection Hotline that receives complaints from voters about problems they're having. We look at search behavior. We still do a little bit with social media, but mostly using it to try to look for problems we've already identified. And then with the help of temporary staff that we hire, student journalists we work with from CUNY, experts who are experts on elections and cybersecurity, we send out these problems that we're finding to our partners, both nationally and locally, so that they can write stories. And we also write stories as well from within ProPublica. So we have this system in place to be able to centralize the information in one place and then send it out so that folks can actually report these stories out. So the way we gather tips, we have a couple of different methods. We have an SMS and WhatsApp bots in English, Spanish, and Chinese. So you can basically just text the bot and it will run you through a series of prompts to ask what your voting experience was like, if you had any issues. We also have a bot that works the same way on Facebook. We have a simple web form, which is what ProPublica commonly uses for a lot of our crowdsourcing. And then we also have a database of these complaints coming into the Election Protection Hotline. So we centralize all of those and go through them during early voting and on election day to identify where problems are happening. So this year, we have run the project since January, and we are working with partners already to try to get them information that can be useful. So that includes things like trainings and other resources, but we also have been gathering records and trying to get data that would also be helpful to them to do pre-election reporting. And this year, a new part of the project, which we actually announced on Friday, is that we awarded 4 grants to local newsrooms that will work with us on stories about voting that we'll publish before the election. And those grants are focusing on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and Georgia. So this year, obviously, we are shifting our focus a bit to be able to capture all of the pandemic-related issues that are happening, and there are many. So obviously, vote by mail is a huge component of that, but it's also things like changes to primary dates, a lot of changes involving polling places. A lot of polling places have been closed or consolidated. The drop in voter registration, how changes related to voting are being communicated, how states are actually planning to change elections, and those changes are happening constantly. And as I mentioned, these partnered investigations. And we also are continuing to partner one-on-one occasionally for stories that we are working on with local and national partners. So as I mentioned, it will be a virtual newsroom in the fall where we'll provide these story leads to our partners and communicate using Slack and Zoom. We also, in our live newsroom, have traditionally had experts literally sitting at a table within the newsroom, and we will also make those experts available, but via Zoom. We, on election day and during early voting, help to distribute partner stories that are produced using our resources. So on our website, on social media, occasionally we'll team up on stories for live coverage. And what we hope to do is have partners in every state. We have coverage in every state at the moment, but we don't necessarily have dedicated local partners in every state yet. So I'm still in the process of recruiting, which is why we're happy for folks to continue to sign up. So just some of briefly what we have accomplished in the past. Our 2016 project was sort of the largest operation. So we had 1,300 participants, and a lot of them involved universities and university students as well as newsrooms. And we produced hundreds of stories, and both at the national and local level. And so here are some examples of the kind of stories that we write about. This is really focused on the actual election process. So we are not looking at the campaigns so much or the sort of politics. We're really focused on access to the ballot and who is able to vote and why people who aren't able to vote are facing these barriers. So some of the impact was people who had been initially denied access to vote were able to vote in New York and Atlanta. Problems with the New York City Board of Elections hotline were fixed. We had wrong information taken down or corrected. And in 2018, similarly, we identified some major problems at an HBCU in Texas where students weren't able to vote, and then after the reporting were able to, and updating information so that people were getting the right information. And this is another example I just wanted to show you of the kind of live reporting that we do. So in 2018, during the midterms, it was raining on election day in New York. And New York actually is a place that has a lot of voting problems. And we started to notice that there were complaints about really long lines in New York City and machine problems. And so we started to look into it. We also used social media to see what people were talking about, and discovered that because it was raining and very humid, the ballots were getting damp and were literally clogging up the machines, which was causing them to break down and was then consequently causing long lines that some people were giving up from waiting on. So we worked together with our partners at courts, with our partners at CUNY, and we built this, this map of where all these problems were happening, and also wrote a story, a national story about it. Our live coverage is distributed in the sense that we're sending information out to individual partners so they can do their own stories, but we also, as I mentioned, like to team up with the various partners we're working with to do these types of stories. So here are some lessons that I wanted to share about what we've learned through doing this project and working with reporters all over the country on how to cover voting. So one of the things that is really important is that reporters get early access to training and resources, and they're not thinking about this as an afterthought on October 31st, that, oh, I have to cover voting. What am I going to do? So making sure that folks are getting introduced to these concepts early and really understand the process and understand what common problems are with voting, because we know that certain things happen every year that have to do with, you know, simple machine malfunctions or not having enough pens at a polling place. There are certain things that happen on a consistent basis that may not represent a serious sort of system breaking issue. We also know how important it is to identify patterns. That's a lot of what our project does, is to gather data so we can be able to see, is this happening across the state? Is the same problem happening in multiple states? So that essentially we can be able to figure out how to invest our energy and time. But that rule certainly also applies to local and national reporters to be able to understand when incidents are isolated or not. It's really important to have access to experts to be able to contextualize what's happening and to understand what's happening, which is why that's a really big component of our project. So that you really understand the nature of the problems that are happening and how they should be addressed. Along those lines, it's also important to get to know election officials well ahead of the election, so that you know who these people are, you're familiar with them, establishing a relationship with them. Source relationship is recommended to do well ahead of the election, so that they will take your call on election day and during early voting when you have questions. And knowing who the right people are is also important for national reporters. We have lists available to our partners of contact information for state election officials, so that you know who to contact. As I mentioned, context is key. Some problems may really be problems like long lines are always a problem in various places, but understanding the context for why they're happening is important. So giving context to the problems, why they're happening, how they're being addressed is important. As I mentioned, we have used social media in a variety of different ways, but another really important use for it is identifying misinformation, because that is often the place that we find misinformation circulating. We just did a story recently on vote by mail misinformation on Facebook, and we work very closely with our partner First Draft on these types of issues. So something that we often do as part of our election reporting is to report on misinformation that has actually reached a critical level on social media, to be able to debunk that. And again, First Draft is really big help on that. And then we also use social media to identify examples of known issues that we are seeing, to be able to back them up and also find additional sources through social media. And as I mentioned, we collect tips through this system that involves texting and forms, but we cannot do that without our network of partners in order to reach people all over the country. We have done these types of collaborative projects before, also with Documenting Hate, which I also ran, and getting partners to buy into this concept of crowdsourcing and to be able to help us with that outreach is absolutely essential to be able to reach people on a national scale. Luckily, we also have access to these complaints from election protection, but we don't get access to contact information for those unless we request it directly. So it is really critical for us to be able to get access to voters directly through crowdsourcing so we can actually talk to people quickly and find out what problems they are having. So just to complete, to end this, I wanted to share a couple of thoughts about things that we have been seeing through our reporting, through our research, through Electionland thus far this year. So the pandemic has really changed what in-person voting looks like. During the primaries, there have been shortages of poll workers basically everywhere because poll workers tend to be older and they are very fearful of getting sick. So people have been dropping out a lot and often at the last minute. Polling places have been refusing to act as polling places anymore, places like churches and schools saying they don't want to be a polling place anymore, and that obligates election officials to scramble and try to find new places or to consolidate polling places. And then social distancing is happening as people are waiting to get into the polling place and also within the polling place having to spread out the voting machines. So all of these issues are leading to longer lines to get in and occasionally confusion about where people are actually supposed to vote. There are always funding problems with elections. Elections are chronically underfunded, but there are huge rising costs because of the pandemic so that states can pay for protective equipment, sanitation equipment, sanitation materials, all of the things that are necessary to protect health. And there are budget shortfalls because the economy is a mess. So this creates a more acute funding problem, and officials are asking Congress to please give them more money for the general election so that they can deal with all of these different problems. Voter registration has fallen, or fell rather, during the first months of the pandemic because so much of voter registration happens in person. But at the same time, turnout has been up in a lot of states that held primaries in the last couple months. There's a clear interest in participating in elections this year. Excuse me. So as I mentioned, vote by mail is going to be a huge issue this year. The increase is going to be significant in how many people vote by mail across the country, but some states are struggling to scale up because they just haven't used it as much before. And it requires a huge logistical operation to print those ballots, send them out and process them, and make sure they get to people on time. So some states have sent out applications to voters to get a vote by mail ballot. Other states have sent out the actual ballot. Some states are changing who is able to vote absentee. In Texas, for example, it's a lot more difficult to vote by mail than it is in, say, Florida. There are witness requirements in some states to vote by mail, which some states are changing because of the pandemic. Some are not. There are postage requirements. There are changes about what states are willing to pay for postage. And then there are a lot of issues with deadlines, with ballots arriving after the deadline. Or not having a postmark so that election officials aren't able to know if it was postmarked in time. I think everyone is familiar with the woes of the post office and this, the USPS, and this is going to has been affecting how vote by mail operates. And then we have seen around the country some voters just not receiving the ballot they requested or it arriving late, so that they are either forced to vote in person or don't end up voting at all. So there's a really wide host of issues here. We also know about problems with these votes being counted. So some of the possibilities that we are facing in the fall, because of the huge uptick in vote by mail, it could take weeks to count all of the votes in the general election, meaning it is unlikely on election night that we will have a definitive winner. And this is something that experts have been warning us about over and over again, to particularly to prepare the media, which is very accustomed to having this election night process for coverage that is just probably not going to be possible this year. We know there's going to be mail voting problems. There's high demand, a lot of logistical issues to address that demand, delivery problems, as I mentioned. And another thing that we have been seeing is problems with signatures and envelopes that result in those votes being not counted. And so that's something that we are doing we are focusing on, and a lot of our partners are focusing on, about making sure or understanding why certain ballots are counted or not, mail ballots. At the same time, we know that in-person voting is still going to happen. There's still going to be tens of millions of people voting in person, particularly because we know that mail voting is just not a reality for everyone. Some states, they are not making it possible for everyone to vote by mail. And even in states that are making it accessible, it may not always work. We have seen a huge number of vote by mail problems here in New York during our primary here. So we know that in-person voting is not going away, and the issues that existed before are only going to be exacerbated. And we know that because of these issues that I mentioned with mail ballots not being counted, because of signature match problems or because of postmark or envelope issues, that states with narrow margins could be a problem. And so we are really preparing for all of these possibilities in the fall, and we are going to start our live coverage operation in October at the latest, so that we can make sure that we are addressing these issues as soon as they are happening, particularly because vote by mail is going to happen over a longer period of time. So we welcome journalists working in newsrooms to sign up to be partners, to join us, and to work with us already on all the resources we have available. And also, if you have questions, I welcome you to email me. So I think with that, I will open it up for questions.